All right, welcome everybody. My name is Jeffrey Curley. I'm from the Mindful Lab at the Zoo. There's a couple of undergraduates that worked on this paper with me. Aaron Fuller, he did a lot of the training. So did Madeline Kowaleski, who gave a talk earlier. So I just wanted to give them a quick shout out. My paper is going to be looking over procedurally generated data sets in respect to explosive hazard detection. And let's get into it. So obviously we're working with UAVs here, unmanned aerial drones. Most of our data sets are going to be at around 30 meters. And the reason that's important, so our simulated data here, a lot of our issues came from we had a lack of access to ground truth. And Madeline Kowaleski kind of talked about this in her paper earlier, is that it might be imprecisely labeled. So we wanted to kind of address that concern. But also this is going to allow us a lot of questions to be answered. And mainly is, when we abstract our data sets, we're going to have access to truth that is so outside of our real world data. We're going to be able to analyze certain features that you wouldn't be able to really ask. And what I mean by that is, if we think about we have these sliders or knobs for our real data features, we're going to be able to tweak them and answer specific questions. So our procedural scene data generation, this is going to be done in Unreal Engine 4. And the reason this is important is because we're going to be able to generate lots of images, lots of data sets that are pseudo-randomly generated. And I'll get a bit more into what that means, but basically we're going to have a lot of looks. We're going to have a lot of looks on our targets and different contexts that we wouldn't normally get from real data. And our specific experiments that we're going to be looking at is time of day. And this is going to be, I'll get a bit more into the specific time of days that we're looking into, but this is going to allow us to relate our simulated data sets to our real data sets in kind of a one-to-one comparison. And for our generalizable abstraction up here, that's looking at how if we saw a picture of a human face, if that was painted by Van Gogh or by another abstract artist, we're going to be able to recognize that that's a human face, and that's going to be kind of our idea of a trustworthy algorithm here. So to get into our big picture here, we can see our procedural scene is generated. And this is going to have a couple different levels. Our cartoon data sets will have different levels of light. And then our game engine quality, which is GEQ here again, that's going to be more closely related to real data sets. And really what we're looking at in this paper is our variables that are going into our scene generation. So our different explosive hazard targets, they're going to have very specific features on them. So they might be round, they might have jagged edges, etc. But we're going to be able to change the scale of these targets, which is going to give us very pixeled on targets here. And the contrast as well. We're going to be swapping textures on these targets. That is going to give us different contrasts in respect to the background. And it's also going to have higher frequency textures. So think like camouflage, or if there is some type of actual elevated texture on these targets. If we look at our environmental details here, our paper is going to be looking at arid only so that we can get a one-to-one control between our cartoon data sets and our game engine quality data sets. And not only that, our foliage is going to follow that same principle, to where the foliage and background clutter we see in one game engine quality data set, we'll see the same in the cartoon data sets. Our platform, this is going to be our UAV here in this case. We're going to be looking at a couple of different outputs. Mainly, we'll be looking at RGB. We have segmentation maps as well for per pixel labeling. Our altitude is going to be fixed at around 30 meters with, I think it's maybe plus or minus a meter for a typical drone data collect. And we're going to be rotating the drone randomly at each camera position. And that's going to give us for our shadows and our context, we'll have different angles in respect to the sun. And this is actually going to be fed into our different algorithms. Madeline Kowaleski talked about the UNet pre-screener. We're going to be using that same architecture here. Our data sets consist of 3 different data sets. They're about 3,000 images with 1,000 images per data collect. And that's where our procedural kind of comes into play. We can get random data collects that are still comparable, so that we're not overfitting or memorizing our data sets. And we're going to just be scoring with our typical ROC curves. She touched on this earlier, but just a quick idea. Our art, as you can see, very abstract. The features are kind of hidden per se, but we can still recognize them. Moving across the spectrum, we can go all the way to real. So this is kind of big part of the paper here. The squares here are going to be representing our targets. And as you can see, as they move from left to right, you see that they have a bit more texture, they have a bit more frequency. That's going to be a big part in our classification for our tune data sets versus our cartoon data sets. And that's a big deal because a lot of these algorithms are going to have a bias towards these high frequency, which isn't necessarily what we're wanting them to learn. And as we go to our actual drone, in our specific context, if you think about our landscape as a square, instead of just moving uniformly across, it's actually going to have some type of randomness in what its next point is. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us multiple looks on the same objects. And because in this situation, we're actually swapping the textures at each frame, it's going to look at an object that has the same lighting because it's still seeing it in the same area on the map, but it's going to have a different texture, which is going to change how the algorithm is looking at it. Our foliage, it's going to be randomly placed throughout the map, each data collection, as well as our actual objects in the scene. So the location for these things is going to be randomized and something that the algorithm isn't going to try to memorize because there's just so many different features for it. So looking specifically at our cartoon data, the middle set here is going to be what we're looking at in this paper, which is only an error data collect. You can see that there's, it's very bright. The contrast, the saturation is all over the place. And if you kind of can see at the top here on one of the targets, it's bright white. There's not a lot of texture or frequency going on. And just to kind of drive through, our data set we'll be looking at here is in the middle again, which is another error. And you can kind of see how the foliage is 1-to-1. There's a lot of clutter. There's a lot of confusers and circular rocks that an algorithm might have. And if we're looking at the occlusion here, you can see that we have a varied amount of occlusion. And that's something that we didn't have a good control on in this paper, that we're looking to get a percentage of, hey, how occluded is an object? Is that affecting how our algorithm is doing on it? So if we look at our first data sets, specifically in this paper, we're looking at time of day. And both the tune and game engine quality are going to have the same principles here. We're looking at noon, which is going to have the highest amount of lux in our scene, which is going to have a much brighter background, as well as very minimal shadows. And as we actually move across here, we can see that we're looking at late day and noon. So we'll have varied amount of lux for the morning and the afternoon with very elongated shadows for our objects. And then we're actually going to have a data set that's across all time of days. And that's both for tune and game engine quality. Now for our data set 7 here, which is our artistic, which is going to be stuff like cell shading. If any of you guys are familiar with what that is, think like, or like a comic strip, it'll be things similar to that. And we had a couple different data sets or a couple different cell shading post-process effects that we added there. This is just going to be for the cartoon data set because it's a lot easier to abstract a simpler data set. And looking into our actual experiments here. So experiment 1 is basically going to be how the in context versus out of context performed. So if we just trained a model on the noon data set, how well is it going to do on the afternoon and the morning data sets? And then for getting it in context, we'll train it on all time of day and then test it on the late day and noon data sets to see how it performed in context. For our experiment 2, this is going to be looking at, again, this is going to be the all time of days for abstracting to tune or game engine quality. So just like I said earlier, kind of with the face example, an algorithm that is only performing well in a certain abstract context, that's not very trustworthy. And you wouldn't really want to trust that with specific decision making if you showed it the same thing, but it's, slightly stylized or artistic and it's not performing well. That's kind of a red flag. So that's kind of what we're looking to address here with this paper. And for equation 4, this is really driving home that we want to see how these models perform on artistic, very stylized data sets. So looking at our specific game engine quality data set we're looking at, this is real pictures that we use for our training and testing. So you can see the solar noon, it's very bright. If we look at the morning, it's a little bit brighter, a little bit more lux, but the shadows are, definitely more pronounced. And at our afternoon, we're getting very severe shadows. Even the clutter on the ground is getting some type of shadow context, which might be a bit, tricky for the algorithm. So just very briefly, we're going to look at the rock curves for our game engine quality and tune. And the reason that we're looking at this, and I guess I probably need to touch on this too. The reason we're looking at tune and game engine quality as well is it's very easy to generate these data sets. real data and physics-based renderings are very costly, and we're trying to analyze, how much data do we really need to give to a machine for it to be successful. So we can see out of context when we just train on the solar noon, it's doing very poorly as we would expect. And in context, it's actually doing, I would say, relatively well. The white here, again, is where it's, classifying these targets. And if we go to the tune data set here, we see it does a bit better out of context, but, it's it repeats itself on the rock curve here, doing very good. We can see that the per pixel labeling is doing what it should be. And this is the interesting question here is when we abstract these data sets, when we go from tune to game engine quality or game engine quality to tune, how are they performing? So the tune data set trained on the game engine quality does relatively well. This is just a qualitative look at this. We'll get into the rock curves after this, but we can kind of see or maybe answer some questions. The tune data set might have learned the shape a bit better. It didn't have access to high frequency textures. And again, just to reiterate, the difference in our game engine quality and our tune targets is one has very simple textures, very plain colors, might have different contrasts, but it doesn't have things like metallic shading on it. It doesn't have high frequency with maybe elevation change a little bit. That's going to affect the shadows. So we see that it didn't actually have access to that information, and it's able to classify these things more so based on shape. Now, extending this to the game engine quality, we see that, again, the white here is where it's classifying a target. So we kind of see a breakdown here when it moves to the tune data set. And our preliminary analysis on this was that because it had access to these high textures, and we know that there is some bias introduced with that, it never really learned to classify these images without that texture. So when it's introduced with these targets that don't have the texture, it doesn't really know what to do. And it kind of just blows up where it sees all these high frequency textures, etc. This is the actual breakdown. As we can see, is what I was saying earlier, our tune performs the best. And remember, this is, abstracted. So the tune data set, which was trained on tune, was tested on game engine quality, which it never saw before, and vice versa. And just as we would expect, the game engine quality biased the tune data set, and it performed worse. And the game engine quality there was at the bottom, which again is we believe that the high frequency here had an effect on its ability to classify. Now, to expand our idea of this trustworthy AI, just like we would be able to detect a face, we want the algorithm to detect a target, even if it's in these strange contexts or strange levels of abstractions. So if we go down to the left, far left down, we can see the different features that are being abstracted. So on the first one, the background has the shadows are a little bit off. There's really no shadows on this. And you can see that the edges are significantly changed. As we move down, we can see that our textures are getting blurred a bit more, and even the edges of the objects are getting these strange, X cross things on them, which we can still recognize that that's a target. But that might have some complications. As we go down even farther, our saturation changes, our shadows changes, our edges changes. All the way to the bottom, we have this dithering effect across the image. And as we see the scale, these are qualitative again, but our game engine quality here on the second row is blowing up again when the edges and textures are changing very significantly. And this is going to kind of get into some of our future work ideas. So really what we did with this paper is we wanted to test different features, parameters, and we were able to do that through our case study of different time of days. And as you guys saw earlier with Madeline Kowalewski's paper, our sim data, when it's augmented with real data, is performing better than just real data. And really, we're able to look at the different features. Oh, sorry about that. We're able to see that, our trustworthy AI is hopefully, if we introduce more tune and game engine quality data sets that have abstracted their features a bit more, hopefully it can learn to classify things better because it's not using features that we don't necessarily want it to know. And so really where we want to move with this paper is introducing more control into our data generation. So we want more parameters on the amount of occlusion, more parameters on specifically the texture, variety, the contrast. So we really want to try to quantify everything that we're introducing into our simulated environment so we can specifically isolate variables and see how that affects our algorithms. And this is going to get into this idea of forcing or giving more looks to an algorithm to kind of sway it to do a certain thing. So as we kind of walk down this list here, you can kind of see how each of these changes in these features are going to affect our targets. And these are just, preliminary results on how our algorithms are classifying them. But if we really want to emphasize shape for a target, and we showed a bunch of images for shape that we can generate procedurally and simulated, hopefully the algorithm is going to pick up that that's a very important feature to learn. And same thing with textures. If we were to take, hundreds of thousands of textures, that's an exaggeration, but if we were to show this algorithm hundreds of textures, it's going to learn that it can't memorize all those textures or use that as an effective way to classify an image or classify a target. And that should conclude it.